The sky hung low, as if mourning something unspoken. Gray light filtered through the clouds like an old memory, soft and reluctant. Snow came down in slow spirals, dressing the dead grass and wagon wheels in silence. No birds sang. No dogs barked. The town was still, except for the corner lot where a wooden platform stood crooked above the frozen mud. A girl stood on that platform. She was small and still, no taller than the post that her wrist was chained to. Her plain cotton dress clung wetly to her frame, soaked from the flurries that had come down all morning. Her hair, long and black, was tied back in a loose knot, the strands matted from cold and time. She stared at the ground, unblinking. As if even her eyes had forgotten what it meant to ask for anything. The sign behind her read, $5 or trade, in smeared black paint. Below it, another note scrawled in chalk, don't talk much. Don't eat much. Don't give trouble. That was the summary of her value, decided by someone else. The man who'd put her there stood nearby, squat and crooked in the spine, with skin the color of beef left too long in salt. He wore a red wool scarf like a snake around his neck and chewed a toothpick with a cruel sort of rhythm. He laughed when someone in the crowd spat on the ground. She's no good to me, he said, shaking his head as if disappointed in the weather rather than himself. Won't even look a man in the eye. Ain't useful in the kitchen or the bed. Just sits there. Like a ghost. The crowd, maybe 10 people, maybe 15, murmured. No one stood too close. Most were townsfolk, grizzled and worn, passing time before dinner. A few looked away, but no one stepped forward. It was easier to stare at the cracked wood of the platform or pretend to notice the snow collecting in their boots than to meet her face. Then a rider came from the east road. He didn't ride fast, nor with any urgency. His horse was dark and lean, its breath misting thick as smoke from a forge. The man wore an oilskin coat heavy with rain stains, a brimmed hat pulled low over his brow, and a leather satchel slung across his chest. He didn't belong to the town. That much was clear in the way the crowd turned. Their posture changed, shifting like cattle scenting a storm. The rider didn't speak. He dismounted without a word, boots crunching in the half-frozen slush. When he stepped forward, his face came clearer beneath the brim, sharp-jawed, sunburnt, eyes like burnt cedar. He moved like someone used to walking long alone. The girl did not look up. The old man noticed him then. You buying or just curious? He barked, louder than needed, already puffing his chest. $5. Or a mule, if she can walk straighter than it. Still, the cowboy said nothing. He walked to the edge of the platform, looked at the girl for a long moment. Not the way others had. Not like she was something to measure or appraise. He looked like he was searching for a sound in her silence. Then he reached into his coat. The silver coins made no grand entrance. No clink, no speech. He just placed them on the edge of the wooden platform, 5 dull, worn dollars, wet from snow. His hand lingered for a heartbeat. Then he looked up at the man. That enough? He asked. The old man blinked. A fool and his silver, I suppose. The cowboy turned his gaze back to the girl, then slowly reached for the iron clasp on the post. It was rusted but not locked. The chain fell with a tired rattle, like it had been waiting to be set down for years. Still, she did not move. Not until he offered his hand, not to pull, not to lead, but to show. An open palm, a choice. She stepped down. Slowly, stiffly. Her boots, thin and cracked, sank into the muddy slush. The chain trailed behind like a tale of shame. The cowboy reached for it without touching her, gathered the length carefully, and coiled it in his coat. They walked away together, quiet as dusk. The townsfolk parted. No one stopped them. A few shook their heads. One woman muttered something about bad omens. Another whispered, it's always the quiet ones that lose their minds. But no one followed. They walked past shuttered saloons, boarded windows, broken barrels spilling soggy grain. Past horses tied to railings and a church whose bell had not rung in years. The girl never looked back. The cowboy never looked at her face. When they reached the edge of town, she paused. Not long. Just a single breath. Then she turned toward the woods ahead, and he followed. The snow fell thicker there, muffling their steps. Pines stretched tall like cathedral columns, and the world narrowed to their two sets of tracks, side by side, fading with each falling flake. The old man stayed behind. He counted his coins, spat in the mud, and laughed again. Fool don't even know what he's taking home, he muttered. But he was wrong. The cowboy knew exactly what he was bringing home. He just didn't know what it would cost him yet. That night, the fire in his cabin burned hotter than it had all winter. And though no words were spoken between them, something softened in the air, not love, not yet. But something kinder than fear, and warmer than chains. And in the silence between them, something small began to grow. Not a flame. A root. Something that would take time. But would hold fast. And wouldn't break easy. Some women are forgotten like wind through pine needles. Others are remembered like thunder that never reached the ground, quiet, but full of power waiting to be known. The snow deepened as they rode, the cold biting sharper with each mile they left behind. The girl sat stiff in the saddle, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the shifting mane of the horse. She had not spoken since they left the auction. She did not ask where they were going. She did not cry. He glanced back at her once as they passed a gnarled birch tree split down the middle by old lightning. She sat upright, shoulders tense beneath the damp fabric of the coat he had draped over her. It swallowed her shape, hung down to her boots, but she held it close without needing to be told. She was used to staying small. Used to being silent. They reached the cabin just before the sky turned to ink. It stood alone among towering pines, its roof slanted under the weight of snow, smoke trailing thin from the chimney like a whisper sent ahead. The door creaked open under his hand, and the warmth inside wrapped them both like breath held too long. She hesitated at the threshold. He stepped aside without a word. She entered slowly, as though the wooden floor might vanish under her. The cabin was simple, one room, one stove, one low bed against the far wall, a bench, a table, shelves cluttered with tins and dried herbs, and an old bearskin nailed near the door. It smelled of pine resin, tobacco, and old fire. He set his saddlebag down and moved toward the hearth, stoking the embers into flame. The light grew until the shadows fell back, and she stood revealed in the golden flicker, hair still wet, cheeks pale but unflinching. She looked around with the careful eyes of someone who had survived too many unfamiliar rooms. He pointed to the bed. She shook her head. He gestured again, slower this time, not commanding but offering. She remained still, her lips parting slightly, not to speak, but to breathe differently, like she was realizing the silence here wasn't a trap. He didn't insist. Instead, he pulled a folded wool blanket from a crate and laid it out near the hearth. He dropped his coat beside it and took the stool without sound. The room settled into quiet. Not hollow. Not heavy. Just quiet, like a forest right before snowfall. She moved then. Carefully. Sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on her knees, eyes darting now and then toward the door. But she didn't ask for it to stay open. She didn't ask for anything. When he handed her a chipped tin cup of warm water, she held it with both hands and drank without meeting his eyes. He did not ask her name. Not that night. Not the next. Each morning, he rose before dawn and split wood. She would watch him through the small frost-laced window, standing in the pale hush of morning light. His movements were slow but steady, each strike of the axe methodical, as though he was breaking something deeper than timber. When he returned, she had already swept the floor. She did small things. She kept the fire burning. She mended an old torn shirt from his trunk with thread she found tucked in a drawer. She boiled water and cleaned the hearthstones with her sleeves. She never asked what she owed. She simply began giving. On the third day, when he came in with bloodied knuckles from a splintered log, she reached for his hand without thinking. He flinched, but she only took a rag from the table and dipped it in warm water. Her touch was feather-light, not intimate, not timid, just precise. As if she'd cleaned many wounds before. He watched her fingers move, and for the first time, noticed her nails were cracked at the edges, her wrists bearing the faint shadows of old bruises. When she was done, she didn't look at him. She returned to folding the blanket as if nothing had happened. He didn't speak, but something shifted. Not visible, not loud, like a river deepening beneath winter ice. The woman who lived nearest, a gray-haired healer named Miriam, came one afternoon. She rode in on a chestnut mare, hunched and bundled in a coat stitched from old quilts. She entered without knocking, squinting first at the girl, then at him. "You weren't never one for company," Miriam muttered, lowering her basket onto the bench. "And now you've got company that doesn't speak." "She speaks," he said quietly. Miriam turned to the girl. "Do you?" The girl nodded once. "Good," said Miriam, unpacking herbs, cloth, a jar of honey. "I won't ask you where you came from. But if you plan to stay, you'll need more than silence and tea." She left after an hour, but not without saying, "She's got strong eyes. Might be the first light in this place since your wife died." The girl heard that. Her hands froze mid-stir in the stew pot. But she didn't ask. And he didn't explain. That evening, he carved a piece of cedar by the fire. She sat nearby, legs curled beneath her, braiding her hair with thin twine. His knife moved rhythmically, shaving the wood into soft curves. She glanced over once, saw that it was turning into the shape of a bird. Not a perfect one, rough, uneven, wings too short, but a bird all the same. He noticed her looking. "Something I used to do," he said. "Makes the quiet feel less empty." She nodded. That was the first night she sang. Softly. Not to him, not for him, but into the air. A melody in her own tongue, hushed and slow, the kind that sounded like it was meant for dusk and smoke and dreams that never spoke loud. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the logs, and listened without breathing too deep. Not wanting to break the moment. She stopped before the last note. But it stayed in the room. The next morning, he found the little wooden bird placed on the windowsill, facing east. Days passed. She said her name one morning, simply, as she placed a bowl of oats before him. He looked up. She said it again, clearer this time. Then spelled it, slow and careful, her finger tracing each letter on the table. He nodded, repeated it once. She smiled, a small, hesitant thing, like a seed deciding whether to rise through frozen soil. He didn't ask her about the old man. About the time before. He knew enough. She didn't ask what he'd lost either. But she touched the worn corner of a picture frame left face down by the hearth. He didn't stop her. Just let it lie. Some truths didn't need speaking to be known. That week, she began sweeping snow off the porch each morning. Not because anyone told her. Because it needed doing. He watched her from inside, watched how her movements were gentle even when the wind bit hard. She was not trying to disappear anymore. She was beginning to belong. They spoke more now. Simple things, firewood, weather, herbs. One night she asked what the word sanctuary meant. He said it was like home, but safer. She nodded like she understood, then whispered it back to herself, sanctuary. Like tasting a new kind of freedom. One afternoon, he gave her a pair of soft leather boots he'd traded for years ago but never used. She looked at them, then at him, unsure. He just set them down and went back to cutting meat. She wore them that evening. The next day, he noticed she walked differently, not faster, not louder, just less afraid of being heard. On the 6th night of the second week, snow fell hard again. They sat near the fire, neither speaking. She held the locket he had left on the mantel. It was empty inside. She turned it over in her palm like a question. Used to carry a photo, he said. Lost it. She nodded, then closed the locket and set it beside the bird. That was the night she said, thank you. Not for one thing. For all of it. He only said, you don't owe me. But his voice cracked, just a little. And her eyes stayed on him longer than they ever had before. In that moment, something passed between them, not love, not yet. But the promise of something rooted deeper than rescue. A kinship not born of pain but of quiet understanding. Of seeing each other not as burdens or ghosts, but as people still rising from ash. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, two people shared a silence that no longer felt like emptiness. And far off in the trees, an owl called once and then was still. Winter came down harder than the year before, like the land had forgotten how to let go. The wind sobbed against the cabin walls night after night, and snow blanketed the world so thickly the sky itself seemed buried. The pine trees bent low, their limbs heavy with silence, and the trails that led to town vanished under drifts too deep for a wagon, too mean for a mule. For 4 days, they didn't open the cabin door. Inside, the fire burned round the clock. He chopped until his shoulders ached, sweat freezing in his collar before it could dry. She kept the stew warm, melting snow to keep the kettle full, watching the shadows play across the floorboards like they might tell her something if she listened long enough. On the second night, the chimney clogged with ice. Smoke coiled in, thick and bitter. He climbed onto the roof, fighting wind that nearly dragged him sideways, and cleared it with the back of an axe. When he came down, soaked to the bone and trembling, she peeled his coat from his shoulders and wrapped him in both their blankets without a word. She pressed a hot cloth to his hands and stayed near the hearth until the color came back to his knuckles. He looked at her, eyes rimmed red from the smoke. You saved me, he said softly. She didn't answer with words, just shifted closer and ladled him a bowl of stew. By the 4th morning, the storm broke. Pale light seeped in under the eaves. They opened the shutters, and for the first time in days, the sky looked less angry. It stretched gray and tired, but wide. The world hadn't ended. It had just held its breath. He found her by the door, gazing out across the clearing, hair braided down her back, a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She turned when he came up beside her. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes were calm. He realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was watching for something. A future, maybe. Or a reason to stay. That night, they shared more than silence. She spoke of the sea, how she'd crossed it in a dark hold below deck, stuffed between strangers and sickness and the smell of iron. Her voice shook at first but steadied with each sentence. She spoke of a brother who stayed behind and a mother who braided her hair with wildflowers. Of the day she was sold like cargo to a man who smiled too much and said too little. He didn't interrupt. He sat with his boots tucked near the fire and listened like the words were a fragile bridge she was building between them, one stone at a time. When she paused, he nodded and said only, I'm glad you made it through. She looked at him then, really looked. And for the first time, her gaze didn't flick away like a frightened bird. Later that week, she asked to learn his name. He told her. then said it again slowly until she repeated it back with careful syllables, like it was something precious. Something earned. She said it once more and smiled, then turned back to the window. He kept staring after her, unable to stop the feeling that somehow, the sound of his name in her voice had given it new weight. They fell into a rhythm after that. Each morning she helped him check the snares in the woods. She moved lightly, not afraid of the cold, her breath curling like smoke in the sharp air. He taught her which prints belonged to deer, which to fox. She showed him how to bind herbs to dry, how to boil ginger for the cough he tried to hide. They didn't talk much out there. But their movements spoke. A rhythm. A trust. A quiet melody rising. One afternoon as snow began to melt along the southern trees, she found a bird with a broken wing beneath a brush of spruce. She brought it inside cupped in her hands, wrapped it in linen, and placed it near the fire. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The bird lasted 3 days. On the 4th, it stopped breathing. She cried then. Not loud. Not long. Just a soft sound in her throat as she buried it near the roots of a pine. He stood beside her with his hat pressed to his chest and waited until the snow covered it again. Then, gently, he said, you gave it peace. That matters. She didn't reply, but later that night, she sat beside him instead of across. Miriam visited once before spring truly took hold. She brought flour and thread, and a little copper bell for the window. The older woman watched the two of them with the eyes of someone who'd seen many winters and recognized the rare thaw between strangers. She's settling, Miriam said as they chopped wood. You've built something here, whether you meant to or not. He didn't answer, but he glanced through the cabin window. The girl was inside, kneeling by the fire, humming under her breath as she stirred the stew. Miriam smiled. You should tell her you see her. Not just as someone rescued. As someone real. I think she already knows, he murmured. The snow retreated slow and stubborn. Beneath it, the earth was wet, hungry for green. She took to planting seeds along the edge of the cabin, careful rows that she watered each day with melted snow. He gave her space to tend them. Watched from the porch as she worked, hair tucked behind one ear, sleeves rolled past her elbows. One evening, he stepped beside her, handed her a carved box he had been working on in secret. Inside it lay the small wooden bird, the one he'd whittled during the worst of the blizzard. She stared at it for a long moment, then ran a finger along its wing. It's crooked, she said gently. So was its flight, he replied. But it still tried. Her lips parted, then pressed closed again. She placed the bird back in the box and held it against her chest. Then, with a breath that trembled, she leaned forward and touched her forehead to his shoulder. Not a kiss. Not a plea. Just a quiet declaration of presence. That night, when the stars pressed close to the roof and the coals glowed soft, she reached for his hand in the dark. Not for passion. For reassurance. He didn't pull away. He held it back. Outside, snow still lined the northern shadows. But where the sunlight touched, the thaw had begun. And in the hush between their breaths, something deepened. Not loud. Not grand. But true. Spring came not with flowers, but with mud. Thick and dark and clinging, it painted the forest paths and softened the cabin walls. Ice melted from the branches and ran in slow streams down the hillsides, washing away the quiet hush winter had left behind. Birds returned first, thin and bright and singing like they hadn't known silence at all. Then came green things, small and trembling, pushing up from the thawed earth like they didn't believe in their own endurance yet. She knelt by the garden most mornings, coaxing life from the wet soil. Her hands were no longer delicate. They bore calluses now, earned from shovel and rope, from chopping and planting, from all the quiet building of a life. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, her braid tight against her back. She still did not speak much, but her silence no longer curled in on itself. It had changed shape. It carried weight. It was a choice now, not a wound. He watched her from the porch, one boot on the step, a cup of warm tea in his hand. There were lines on his face, always had been, but they softened when he looked at her. Not because she needed him. Because she didn't. Because she had come through fire and frozen earth and still rose each morning to tend something fragile. She reminded him of the first green shoot he'd ever seen after a wildfire. Delicate, yes. But stubborn enough to survive hell. It wasn't love yet. Not in the way townsfolk used the word. But it was something deeper than obligation. Stronger than gratitude. It was respect. It was kinship. It was the first root of something that might last beyond the thaw. But spring did not bring only warmth. News travels slow in the west, but it travels. Whispers made their way back from the auction town. A few riders passed through the settlement to the north, carrying feed and fence wire, and when they stopped at the saloon, they spoke low about the man who bought a girl in chains and brought her into the pines. Some said he was keeping her hidden. Others said he was raising a wife from someone else's punishment. None of them said her name. None of them asked what she wanted. And the world, having forgotten her once, now remembered her all wrong. It began with looks. The first time she rode into town beside him, heads turned. The sheriff's eyes lingered too long. A woman at the general store muttered something beneath her breath. When he reached for salt and coffee, the shopkeeper hesitated. Not enough to name. Just enough to feel. She kept her chin up. Paid for her own cloth. Helped an older man pick up a dropped basket outside. But as they rode home, she sat quieter than usual. Her hands, always calm, fidgeted in her lap. "They don't see me," she said finally, when the trees swallowed the road again. He looked over. "They see a story someone else told." He nodded once. He didn't try to correct it. She was right. And she had earned the truth of it. A week later, the old man came. The same one who had chained her to the post. He rode in with 2 others, both younger, both smug with the easy cruelty of men who believed they'd been wronged. They came up the hill in the evening light, their horses stamping mud and spooking the hens in the coop. She was inside, folding clean linens. He was on the porch, carving a handle for the new axe. The old man didn't dismount. "Well, well," he called, lips curling. "Thought I might find you here. Been hearin' stories. Heard you took what wasn't yours." The cowboy stood slowly, the knife still in his hand. He said nothing. "She belonged to me," the man went on. "You paid for her, sure, but only half what I was owed. Ain't how debt works." Inside, she froze. "I didn't buy a debt," the cowboy said evenly. "I bought a life. She's not yours." The man sneered. "Now you listen." But the girl stepped out onto the porch then. Her hair was loose, her eyes steady. She did not flinch. Did not look at the other men. Only at him. "I will not go with you," she said clearly. Her voice cut through the evening like a bell in fog. "And I was never yours. Not for a day. Not for $1. The man's face turned red, then pale. His mouth opened, but the words came crooked. "You best watch your tongue," he hissed. "You think you're safe in these woods?" "I know I am," she said. One of the younger men reached for something beneath his coat. The cowboy's stance shifted. Quietly. No threat, no rage. Just readiness. But nothing came of it. The old man spat into the dirt. "This ain't finished." And they rode off. Not fast. Not ashamed. Just loud enough to say they'd be back. She didn't speak for the rest of that night. But she didn't cry. She sat near the hearth, sewing the last buttons onto a shirt she had mended. Her hands were steady. Her mouth tight. But her eyes were distant. Later, when the fire had burned low and the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, he reached over and placed a hand over hers. "You don't have to be brave tonight," he said. She didn't look at him. But she let her shoulders fall. Let herself lean against him for just a breath. Then too. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. "I'm just tired of being watched like I might vanish if no one holds a rope." He closed his eyes and let her words settle like dust on wood. Real. Heavy. Unmoving. She slept with her back to the door that night, not from fear, but as if daring the world to try again. In the days that followed, townsfolk whispered more. Some louder now. The preacher came by to ask questions with syrupy concern. Miriam came by with food, but her mouth was tight, her voice low. "They'll come again," she said. "Men like that never leave quiet." He nodded. "Then I'll be ready." "She's not a secret anymore," Miriam warned. "They know where she is. And they don't like that she stayed. She's not hiding." "No," Miriam said. "But that don't mean they'll leave her be." Spring warmed the earth. The seedlings she planted began to bloom, green shoots, eager and real. The birdhouse he'd built filled with song. The porch stayed swept. The table held 2 plates. And still, the shadow of the old world crept closer. The town had begun to remember the girl they tried to forget. But they did not remember her as she was. They remembered her as silence. As scandal. As a thing that should have disappeared. And she, who had finally become whole, now had to face the storm of being seen. It began before sunrise. The woods were still dark, the wind sharp with the last breath of spring frost. He was outside, splitting kindling by the side of the cabin, when he heard the low crunch of hooves over wet earth. Not many. 6 maybe, 7. Moving steady. Not fast, not loud. But coming with purpose. Like a storm that had decided not to roar but to press down slow and heavy. She was already awake. He knew it before he stepped inside. She stood near the window, her shawl tight around her shoulders, her eyes locked on the tree line where shadows began to stir. The fire crackled, untouched. Her hands were still. Not trembling. Just waiting. He crossed the room without speaking, reached for the rifle behind the door, then paused. Her gaze met his. "Will we run?" she asked. He shook his head. "They just follow." She turned back to the window. "Then we stay." He nodded once. That was all. There was nothing to say between them that hadn't already been built in silence, meal by meal, gesture by gesture, day by quiet day. They had not made promises. But they had shared something more binding than that: space, trust, breath. And that morning, they would share defiance. He stepped out onto the porch. The first of the riders broke the clearing, the old man again, jaw set like stone, eyes narrow. Behind him, a deputy with a badge too clean for use, and 4 more men with rifles slung across their backs. The sheriff was last to appear, his hat low and his coat unbuttoned like he didn't want to be here but couldn't stay away. The girl stepped out beside the cowboy, bare feet brushing the morning dew on the porch planks. She didn't look at the riders. She looked at the trees beyond them. The horizon. The space where something better waited, even if the world refused to grant it. The old man was the first to speak. "She's stolen property," he growled. "You had no right. She was taken from my land." The cowboy didn't raise his voice. "You chained her. She was mine. She's not now." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Town's been talkin'. You've stirred up trouble. And there's concern she ain't here of her own will." She stepped forward then. Not behind him. Not protected. She stood where they could all see her. "I choose this place," she said. "I chose it every day since the day I was freed." The deputy snorted. "Freed? You were bought." "I was seen," she answered. The old man's face twisted. "Don't matter what she says. She don't belong. Not to this land. Not to you." "She doesn't belong to anyone," the cowboy said. Behind them, from the trail that led east, another horse approached. Then two. Miriam rode in first, her gray coat fluttering, her mouth set in a line. Beside her came the blacksmith, a man with arms like tree limbs and a voice like gravel. Behind him, the preacher, white hair pulled back, riding a mule too stubborn to fear men with rifles. They did not speak as they entered the clearing. They simply stopped and dismounted, walked to the porch, and stood beside the couple without ceremony. Not loud. Just present. The sheriff hesitated. The preacher finally spoke. "You come to enforce law, or to rewrite it?" The sheriff looked at him. "They're saying she don't belong." The preacher's eyes turned to the girl. "She stands freer than any man here. And I'll testify to it." Miriam added, "That man chained her. This one fed her. You tell me who broke the law." The old man's voice cracked. "She's a foreigner. You think you'll stop us from taking her back?" The blacksmith stepped forward. "You'll have to take us, too." One of the younger riders lifted his rifle slightly. The cowboy moved his hand to his belt. The girl stepped down from the porch, her shawl trailing behind like smoke. "If you think I'm something to be taken," she said softly, "you've already lost." And then she turned her back to them, walked to the garden, and knelt in the dirt beside the green shoots, her hands pressing gently into the soil. Not hiding. Not running. Just tending to life. The riders looked to the sheriff. He watched the girl. Then looked at the man beside her. Then at the line of neighbors, old and scarred and weathered, standing without fear. He pulled his hat lower. "I see no crime here," he said. The old man spat. "Coward." "No," said the sheriff. "Just tired of fixing what you break." The riders turned. The old man cursed. But they left. And with them went the last shadow of her chains. She didn't rise from the garden until the hoofbeats faded. When she did, he was there beside her. He knelt, not to protect her, but to plant the next seed. She placed it in the earth with careful fingers. Pressed down gently. And for the first time, she smiled with no shadow behind it. That evening, they sat on the porch beneath a sky too wide to ever be owned. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder. His arm wrapped around her not as a shelter, but as an answer. The wind was warm. The air smelled of pine and ash and something growing. She looked at him. "Is this home?" she asked. He looked at her hands, calloused, steady, strong. "Yes," he said. "Because you made it one." And far beyond the trees, the world went on remembering her wrong. But in this clearing, where her voice had risen and held, where her hands had planted and healed, she had already rewritten her story. Not a girl rescued. Not a woman owned. But someone whole. And free. And here to stay. Some things cannot be stolen back. Some lives, once claimed by kindness, cannot be touched again by cruelty. She had been chained. She had been forgotten. But in the quiet cabin beneath the pines, she had been remembered, and this time, truthfully.